Welcome everyone. My name is Rachel Riggs. I am the Digital Learning Specialist for the EdTech Center at World Ed. We have some Zoom information on the screen here for you, but if you run into any troubles, you can contact my colleague Ebony Vandross at evandross@worlded.org for any assistance during today's session. Please do jump into the chat. We have people introducing themselves and letting us know if they are joining CoAbe in person or virtually. So let us know. Welcome, welcome. And Ebony just put into the chat a link to the amazing app that she created so that you can see where World Ed will be during CoAbe. So please do check that out. Hello, Paula. Hello, hello. Today, we're going to be talking about the Digital Equity Act and the EdTech Makerspace. We have a few announcements that we'll go through before today's session, and then we have two lightning talks, about 15 to 20 minutes per. Once we finish each lightning talk, there will be a time for questions, and then once both of the lightning talks end, we will have a 30-minute breakout room discussion with the presenters for you to get deep into the weeds on these topics and ask them all of your pressing top of mind questions. So I'm joined today by my two colleagues, Ebony and Annalisa, who will be supporting the session. And our guests are Shirley, Jana, Kathy, and Kimberly, who I will introduce more in depth in a minute. First announcement, please, if you're going to CoAbe, whether you're joining in person or online, please do come to our Digital Literacy and Technology Strand meeting. This is going to be an interactive Strand meeting full of rich discussion around what links EdTech and digital literacy, where do they intersect, where do they diverge, and we're also going to layer in some conversation around digital resilience and some strategies around building digital resilience. So that will be Monday from 5 to 6 Pacific time. I think it's 8 Eastern time. Check me on that though. And we're really excited. We really know that so many rich ideas come from these annual meetings. So do join us. Also we have so many exciting updates from our DRAW initiative, the Digital Resilience in the American Workforce Initiative. I could hardly cover them in the time that they need, but we did launch our Digital Skills Library. It's at digitalskillslibrary.org, which was a part of the DRAW initiative. And we're very excited about all the great resources that you can now find on that website. There was a links discussion this week. It's wrapping up today, but it was focused on instructional strategies and content for building digital resilience. And it's been a really rich discussion. So I encourage you to go back and revisit it, jump in. It's, it'll stay up. So jump in and add your comments and let's keep it going beyond this week. We are coming out with a blog series. So we will be putting out a lot of content around digital resilience in that blog series, along with an instructional strategies brief. We're launching a Twitter chat, and then we'll have our report and presentations. And we're very excited about all of the great things coming out of that initiative. All right. And finally, we do have an upcoming webinar in the Links Integrating Technology group on innovative remote ESOL program models and promising practices. This is on the 21st at 12 p.m. Eastern. And lots of great promising practices that came out of remote ESOL programs, what worked for them when they went remote, what lessons learned they have. So please do join that webinar if you want to hear more about remote ESOL promising practices. And Ebony has been a machine in the chat box, dropping links to all of the great announcements that we just had. So if you want to learn more or register for those events, just look in the chat and you can find links to all of that there. Without further ado, I'm super excited today to bring in some of my colleagues from World Ed who are going to talk to us about the Digital Equity Act and give us a little quick Lightning Talk 101. As a reminder, at the top of the hour at 2 p.m. Eastern, we will have breakout rooms for you to join Shirley and Catalina in a breakout room to ask more questions. So they're going to do a quick lightning talk. We can take a few questions, but if you want to go more in depth, stick around for the breakout sessions. So Catalina Catalina Gonzalez is our Senior Technical Advisor at World Ed, and Shirley Doan is our Senior Project Coordinator at World Ed. And I will let Shirley take it away.
Hi, everyone. Sorry, give me 1 second to get my slides up. And thanks, Rachel, for giving us time to talk today during today's session. We're very excited to talk about the Digital Equity Act. So for some context, I have been working alongside my colleagues Catalina and Judy Morcrude on a new project from World Education called Transforming Immigrant Digital Equity, or TIDE, and you can find more information about that project on the EdTech Center website. But one of the main branches of this project is advocacy around the Digital Equity Act, and so that is the focus of today's session. So what exactly is the Digital Equity Act? The Digital Equity Act is part of the Infrastructure Investment and Jobs Act, also known as the Bipartisan Infrastructure Law, that was passed last November, and it allocates $2.75 billion in spending over 5 years. All of that funding is being administered through the Department of Commerce's National Telecommunications and Information Administration, otherwise known as the NTIA. And there is a link to the full text if you'd like to read a little bit about that over the weekend. So what is the imperative behind digital equity? Or rather, what does Congress say is the imperative behind digital equity? So in the Digital Equity Act, Congress makes the following case: that first, broadband and digital literacy are critical to participating in US systems and accessing essential services such as public benefits. 2, that digital exclusion is harmful and exacerbates existing wealth and income gaps. 3, that there is a need for additional and sustained investment in research in digital equity. 4, that federal, state, local, tribal, and other governments have social, legal, and economic obligations that extend to how their citizens and how their residents access and use the internet. And lastly, number 5, that digital equity is a matter of social and economic justice. And as you can imagine, this kind of language is actually very encouraging and rewarding to hear from Congress. The Digital Equity Act also lays out 3 important definitions for digital literacy, digital equity, and digital inclusion. Oftentimes, when we talk about digital literacy, there is a tendency to conflate these terms or to use them in different ways. And this kind of helps set standardized definitions for all of us to be able to communicate with each other and to define our work. So digital literacy is defined as the skills that are associated with using technology to enable users to find, evaluate, organize, create, and communicate information. Digital equity is the condition in which individuals and communities have the IT capacity that is needed for full participation in the society and economy of the United States. And then the definition for digital inclusion is a little bit longer. It includes several different elements, including affordable access to and the use of reliable broadband, internet-enabled devices, as well as applications and online content. And then there's also digital literacy training, quality technical support, as well as knowledge to ensure someone's online privacy and cybersecurity. So the way we like to think of it is that all of these digital inclusion activities that I just mentioned will lead to the state of digital equity. So the big question is, where is all the money going? And to that end, Digital Equity Act funding is going into 2 streams, one for states and one for non-state entities. And so we'll talk more about the state funding first, because that is what is coming down the pipeline first. In order to be eligible for Digital Equity Act funding, interested states first have to appoint an administering entity to oversee the planning and implementation of Digital Equity Act funding. And that is the responsibility of each state's governor. And we'll talk a little bit more about who's eligible to become an administering entity in a later slide. Then states have to apply for planning funds and develop their state digital equity plan over the course of a year. And lastly, submit that state digital equity plan for formula funding via the State Digital Equity Capacity Grant, which allocates $1.44 billion over 5 years. That formula funding takes into account the total number of individuals within that state, specifically also the total number of individuals that fall into the covered populations category, as well as the state's relative lack of availability and adoption of broadband service. So in terms of where we are with regards to the timeline, right now we're waiting for the notice of funding opportunity to come out for the State Digital Equity Planning Grant, and that is expected out in late May 2022. And that will allocate $60 million to states in order for them to develop their digital equity plan again over the course of a year. States will have 60 days to respond to that notice of funding opportunity and apply for those funds. So what is in the State Digital Equity Plan? The State Digital Equity Plan has 5 main components. So first of all, the plan has to include all of the barriers to digital equity that the covered populations face within the state. The plan also has to include measurable objectives for documenting and promoting broadband access, online accessibility of public services, digital literacy, individual online privacy and cybersecurity, and the availability and affordability of consumer devices and technical support. The plan also has to include assessment of how all of those above objectives will impact and interact with the state's goals, including their economic and workforce development goals, plans and outcomes, educational outcomes, health outcomes, civic and social engagement, and delivery of other essential services. So really taking a holistic look at how digital literacy and digital equity impact somebody's ability to participate in both society and the economy. And lastly, there is a huge focus on collaboration. So each plan has to include a description of how the state will collaborate with key stakeholders to achieve all of those objectives above. And as you can see, who qualifies as key stakeholders, that includes a variety of different entities, including community anchor institutions, nonprofit organizations, organizations that represent the people that fall under covered populations, state agencies that administer adult education activities, so the State Adult Education Office, public housing authorities, and other agencies that you may be part of. And to that end, to show that states are collaborating with key stakeholders, the state also has to include a list of organizations with which they are actually collaborating with on the digital equity plan. So let's take a little bit of time to look at who is actually eligible to become an administering entity. The administering entity, which again will be decided by the state's governor, is responsible for developing, implementing, and overseeing the state digital equity plan. And they can also make subgrants to the key stakeholders that I just mentioned, who can support the state digital equity plan and those digital inclusion activities. So the administering entity can be the state itself. We're seeing that probably a lot of states will go in the way of their broadband office. But entities that are also eligible include non-school not-for-profits, community anchor institutions, workforce development program providers, local education agencies, and again, state agencies that administer adult education activities. And to further clarify the definition of a community anchor institution, so the Digital Equity Act defines that as a public school, a public or multifamily housing authority, library, medical or healthcare provider, community college or other institution of higher education, state library agency, and any other nonprofit or governmental community support organization. So I would wager that pretty much all of us fall into at least one of these categories that have been mentioned so far. So when I talk about covered populations, who am I actually referring to? So there's a broad definition of who's covered. First of all, in terms of the households that are covered, the Digital Equity Act defines those households as at or below 150% of the federal poverty level. And then for covered populations, that encompasses the individuals who live in those households, as well as aging individuals, incarcerated individuals other than those who are incarcerated in a federal correctional facility, veterans, individuals with disabilities, individuals with a language barrier, individuals who are members of a racial or ethnic minority group, and individuals who primarily reside in a rural area. So all of those populations are prioritized under the Digital Equity Act. And in terms of implications for immigrants and refugees, it's encouraging to see that the Digital Equity Act explicitly covers individuals with a language barrier, including individuals who are either English learners and or have low levels of literacy. And of course, many of the learners that we serve also fall into multiple covered categories. So it's important that we are able to identify and advocate for those learners. Taking a step back from all of the state funding, so again, thinking about the planning grant money coming out in May 2022, and then states having a year to write their state digital equity plan, then to submit it for the capacity grant funding. We're looking at the other non-state funding coming out at 2023 at the very, very earliest. So this funding would come out through the Digital Equity Competitive Grant, which allocates $1.25 billion over 5 years. And that funding will only open after all of the state capacity grants have been awarded. In terms of who's eligible to apply for this funding, and again, it's competitive funding, so no formula funding. That includes community anchor institutions, again, as well as local education agencies, entities that carry out workforce development programs, and partnerships between or among any of these entities that are mentioned in this list. So even though the planning grant funding is coming out in May, right now, we strongly encourage that you don't wait until May to get started in terms of advocacy and thinking about how your organization can get involved. In terms of what you can do right now, it's really important to start building those relationships with your state and local representatives and offices to make sure that your voice and your students' voices are heard, and to start building relationships with other potential digital equity partners in your area, because no one can do all of those digital inclusion elements by themselves, and we don't want to duplicate any of that work. So start building those connections and thinking about how you can leverage each other's expertise. Very importantly, educate your network, so other adult education providers and also other community organizations, about the Digital Equity Act. This slide segment that I showed right now is actually just a small part of a fuller deck that is available on the EdTech website. You can use those slides to educate anyone in your network about the Digital Equity Act funding and what people can do in order to advocate for their constituents. And when that state planning NOFO finally comes out in May 2022, remember to advocate for immigrants and refugees and your students to be fully represented in the Digital Equity Plan. Make sure that community anchor institutions who serve covered populations are at that planning leadership table and are able to receive funding. We want to highlight existing trusted models of digital equity services and the expertise of organizations that have been serving these covered populations for decades. And we want to make sure that all aspects of digital inclusion, especially digital literacy, are included. When the NOFO comes out, we as World Education will also be releasing some guidance on the State Digital Equity Plan and talking points that you can use. Looks like I'm a little ahead of time, so if anyone has any questions, and Rachel, can you let me know? I can't see the chat right now.
Yeah, absolutely. I haven't got any questions yet, except for some private messages saying, hey, can we have these slides? Which is totally understandable. There are some great talking points and links in Shirley's slides. So you guys look out for a follow-up email from Ebony. And also I'm putting into the chat a resource webpage where you can find all of the resources and recordings from past desk sessions. And so we'll put this up on that page as well. Please go ahead and sound off with your questions in the chat box. We have time to take a few. We have one from Jose. Is there a place to know who are the representatives that are managing this in each state, Shirley?
So I believe so. They haven't released those entities yet, and we are actually in conversation with the NTIA to see if those entities will be made public. This is in reference to the administering entities for each state, right?
Yeah, I think so. Jose, if you want to, yes, he says correct. Yep.
Yeah, we are still waiting to hear back to see if that list will be made public.
Great, thanks. Any other questions for Shirley about the Digital Equity Act, the next steps. Okay, Laura asks, can you speak more to the examples of organizations that may be eligible for subgrants for the planning process?
Can you elaborate on that question? Do you want more definitions of organizations or how organizations can get involved?
Yeah, Laura, can you elaborate in the chat, or feel free to unmute yourself and ask Shirley your question? That's fine too.
Oh, great, thanks. Yeah, I thought that there was a slide towards the top of your presentation, which has been great and very helpful, by the way, that said there might be subgranting for the, yeah, exactly, making subgrants to key stakeholders who would support the digital inclusion activities. So that was something I hadn't heard about, and I'd be interested to learn a little more if there is any information about that particular piece.
So this particular piece about making subgrants to key stakeholders for implementation of digital inclusion activities would fall under the capacity grant, not necessarily the planning process.
Oh, got it. Okay, thank you.
Great, and I see a comment from Gwen referring us to the NTIA State Broadband Leaders Network to find out who's currently engaged. So thank you, Gwen. Any other?
Yeah, I can drop a link in the chat to that page right after this.
Thank you, Shirley, awesome. Any other questions for Shirley? As a reminder, at 2 p.m. Eastern, Shirley will be facilitating a breakout room where you guys can really talk a little bit more in depth about your specific context and have, if you have any more specific questions for Shirley that you want to talk through. So the breakout rooms will be a good place to do that. But if you have a quick question you want to drop in, feel free. All right. So I am now going to transition us over to our second lightning talk of the day, another very exciting topic with lots of implications for future opportunities. Let me get this slide up. Somebody's, okay, great, awesome. So we have Jana Harper, Kathy Elizondo, and Kimberly Elliott here today. They join us from Central Arizona College. They are instructional specialists for their state, and they have been participants in EdTech Makerspaces. So they are going to share a little bit today about what it looks like to participate in an EdTech Makerspace, what it looks like to use the resources from an EdTech Makerspace, and also what it looks like to design your own EdTech Makerspace project. So they're going to bring in a lot of different perspectives on this PD model, the professional development model for EdTech Makerspaces, which we call PD with purpose. And as you'll see in a moment, it's PD that provides lots of learning opportunities, but also the opportunity to make something that can be used for teaching and learning. So I'm going to hand it over to Jana Harper, who has been EdTech Makerspace participant, EdTech Makerspace resource user, and now EdTech Makerspace designer. She's worn all the hats, and she's going to share with us kind of her story of how the EdTech Makerspace has impacted her practice. So go ahead, Jana.
All right, all the hats. I love it. So here with me today, like she said, is Kathy and Kimberly from my team at Central Arizona College. We're all instructional specialists. We work together daily. We teach and oversee all subjects related to adult ed and have different perspectives coming into this project. So it has been a good experience. But let me back up to summer of 2020. That is, as you recall, that was quite a big summer. That's when I participated in my first EdTech Makerspace, and the whole project was based on the stories and supplemental materials from Reading Skills for Today from Southwest ABE, which I always think should be Arizona because Southwest, but Southwest ABE is in Minnesota, where all great things come from. So for those of you not familiar with reading skills for today, they have almost 350 leveled stories with supplemental materials, all of them written for our adult learners. So if you recall, in 2020 is when we suddenly needed more resources that we could easily use in all the different remote learning situations that we found ourselves in. And that's when Jeff Goomis, man extraordinaire, developed the first ETMS project. I believe it's the first ETMS project. So that was designed to be professional development with purpose, where teachers would learn EdTech tools and create some reusable, mobile-friendly resources. I signed up for that just because I had kind of been following Jeff because he was always doing interesting stuff. Didn't really know what I was signing myself up for, just jumped in. And of course, Jeff had it all worked out. All I had to do was show up, follow directions. So by the end of that project, all of us who had participated, and I see a few names in the meeting here. I see some of you were in this as well. We all learned to use Wakelet, Quizlet, and Google Forms. And not only that, but we learned some really valuable lessons about designing lessons with consistency and uniformity, especially reusability and access and organizing resources. So I mentioned we started with the stories from Reading Skills for Today. Each story there has this fantastic supplemental document with some really great activities. You can see there's vocabulary, language or grammar, a speaking activity, an assessment like a multiple choice reading skills, and a writing activity. So for our project, we started with the vocabulary lesson and then put all those words and definitions into a Quizlet. I'm sure most of you are familiar with Quizlet. And then for the comprehension quizzes, we took the assessment questions from the supplement and put those into a Google form set up to run as a quiz. So all these resources are collected in an online site called Wakelet. And I'm sure some of you are already using the Wakelet, but if not, a Wakelet collection is like a one-stop shop for whatever you want to store there. You can post links, images, documents, all kinds of stuff. Anything you want, you put it in a collection in one Wakelet. So here we just made simple Wakelets with the Quizlet, the vocabulary Quizlet, a link that goes back to the story, and the comprehension check. So what that means is you would share one link with your learners and they have all of it, all in one place. There's also a Wakelet for all the different resources that were associated with the project, including the stories, the individual Wakelets, and a massive spreadsheet with all the URLs for the different activity pieces. So you can see, maybe it's too small, but this is a visual of the Wakelet, of the spreadsheet. This is the resource that I use the most. And it has the link to the Quizlet, a link to the Google Forms, a link to the copy. So you can mix and match the pieces if you want to. And at first, right after we had finished up this project, I didn't have a class of my own. So for the next year, I just tried to like spread the word and convince other people to use it. But I didn't really have that boots on the ground experience. Then in January, I got my own class and I knew right away that I wanted to use the Wakelets, but it was an English language class and a lot of my students were very beginning level learners. So I knew I needed some lower level stories. Even the level 1 stories were a little bit too hard for them. So I did some scouting and imagine my excitement when I found that there was another EdTech Makerspace project that were also using Wakelets with stories and supplemental resources, but these were from the ESL Story Bank from Literacy Minnesota. Again, shout out to Minnesota. So these stories from the ESL Story Bank are for beginning and pre-beginning English language learners. So it's perfect. At first, I was sharing the Wakelets as is, just shooting them out the link, and then the students would work through the different activities. But once I got more comfortable with it, I started building on the existing Wakelets to personalize them for my class and how I like to do things. The Wakelets themselves are super easy to copy and edit. You can add things, you can take things out. So for example, I would recommend updating the Google Forms right away so that you get the form in your Google Drive and it doesn't go to someone else's. But really, the possibilities are endless. So now I'm building a collection of stories that I just keep adding to and modifying however I like. Like I said, I started out using them just as is, but once I got more comfortable with everything, because there's a learning curve of navigating all the pieces if you want to start editing. But I have a system, so I can really quickly find, modify, and even submit them to our state teacher verification model resource repository. I just have this whole system where I'm like copying and pasting and moving and boom, 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 done. So the students can get proxy hours for completing these Wakelets. So that's kind of my current experience. I started as a participant in a project, and then I became a very seriously dedicated user and adapter of the resources that had already been created. And my next step has been to learn how to design my own Makerspace project. And with that, I will turn it back to Rachel to talk about the design course.
Okay, yes, thank you so much for sharing, Jana. So as you can tell from Jana's story, the EdTech Makerspace model is, educators getting together, learning technology together, which we know is a need for PD, but also creating these open educational resources that are usable and reusable. And so learning some instructional design elements that allow other instructors to take what you've made and run with it. And just like Jana said, modify the Google Forms, create new Wakelets, and kind of adapt things. So we are expanding this model. We have run many EdTech Makerspaces as part of the EdTech Center at World Ed and Crowded Learning, but we really want to equip other teachers, programs, anybody to be able to run their own EdTech Makerspaces so that they can generate more great OER that can be shared across the nation. So we have an open access guide that has been created for anyone to design their own EdTech Makerspace project. It's on our website, it's open to anyone, and it takes you through the steps of incorporating all of the connected practices to ensure that you're creating stuff that is reusable and customizable and accessible. We also have the Ideal 103 course. So anyone who is an Ideal member state has access to this course as part of their membership. If you're not an Ideal member state, you still can purchase the course for a fee. Facilitation is an added fee for Ideal member states as well, but that course comes along with a project planning workbook and really takes participants through the steps of designing their EdTech Makerspace project. So like I said, we want to equip other people to run their own EdTech Makerspaces and keep this great PD model going and churning out OER. So with all of that said, I am super excited to hand it over to Kathy and Kimberly. They were in the course with Jana, they worked as a group, and they designed their own EdTech Makerspace project. And they're going to tell us exactly what they're planning on doing with their EdTech Makerspace project. So go ahead, guys. Very exciting.
All right, so we designed a project when we took the EdTech Makerspace project course. The goal of the course was to design a service learning EdTech Makerspace project that teaches educators new skills and tools in educational technology while producing reusable open educational resources for use in adult education. The requirements of the course was to meet every 2 weeks, complete all assignments in between meetings, and work through the steps of the course workbook. We also met as a team and completed individual as well as group assignments.
Our first step was to reflect on what we know is a need in adult education and really finding those really intense needs that we have all felt in the classroom. And then find or create content to match that. We identified that there is a need for age-appropriate visual data content for adult learners. This is a skill needed by them in all aspects of life. As educators, we know that it is difficult to find well-organized content in this area. As we looked into what was available, we found what is termed slow reveal graphs. From this point, we each developed our own mock-ups for the project without having input or discussions with the other members. We wanted to get a variety of options that could be used for the project and then pick out the good from everybody's.
We would now like to share an example of a slow reveal graph with you. As you can see, it starts out very minimally and allows the students a chance to focus in on the shapes and the colors of a graph and lets them start thinking about what the graph might be about. Each slide reveals additional information and a question for the student. With each new piece of additional information, the teacher will ask the student guiding questions to help them interpret the graph. In section 2, our goal was to match our learning goals to EdTech tools. This was an important step for us in that we learned to focus on goals before tools. As educators, it's easy to get too excited about experimenting with fun new tools, but this step required that we focus in on our goals first. We were also taught to focus on reusability and accessibility, which also helped narrow down the tools we ultimately chose, which were the suite of Google tools, including Slides, Forms, Jamboard, Sheets, and Docs.
In session 3, our objective was to develop materials that would guide ETMS participants through the process of adapting, creating, and/or curating resources in a way that maximizes reusability. We learned about accessibility and universal design. While we have cultivated a template and a sample of what we hope the final product will look like, we still need to design learning resources. These will follow the POUR, the perceivable, operable, understandable, and robust framework that we were taught, and will include step-by-step guides. Some of these guides we are going to adapt right from Crowded Learning.
Once a template and user guides are completed, we will need to train instructors to continue the project to create additional resources. We have created an interest form for anyone interested in pursuing the project.
Once completed, this project will continue to be a resource that is expandable to add new visual data to the project. We are exploring various methods to disseminate this project to the public and make it accessible globally.
Let's take a moment to show you our preliminary example using Google Slides, Jamboard, and Google Forms, and teaching adult learners about stacked line graphs. We start off by engaging the students by showing a brief video introducing the type of graph.
We start with finding out what they know about this particular type of graph. This would be in the form of a Google Jamboard where students can collaborate using digital sticky notes.
Now we go through the presentation of the slow reveal graph, similar to what you saw earlier.
For students in an online setting, this slide could be adjusted.
Again, for students in an online class, the teacher can ask students to create a discussion post or a chat to answer this question.
At this point, students are given an entirely new graph of the same type to see if they are able to apply their knowledge on a new graph. The questions shown here are given to students in a Google form quiz so that the teacher can collect responses to gauge student understanding and mastery. And here is what the Google form looks like. Again, an interactive link for students to share their thoughts is given in this slide.
Then we have an additional reading about the same type of chart. In addition, or in lieu of more information about the specific type of graph, teachers can find reading material on the specific subject of the graph, if that's more appropriate for their lesson of the day.
And what we're showing you here is an example of what our Google Sheet will look like, housing all the various components of each visual data set. That way teachers can grab the components very easily for what they want to use, or they can use the entire slide deck.
That was awesome. I can't decide if I want to be a part of the EdTech Makerspace that you guys are doing, or if I want to be in your class when you're using these materials. It all looks very fun. Thank you guys so much for sharing your plans for the EdTech Makerspace. I want to give a minute for anybody to ask questions about the project that Kathy and Kimberly and Jana have designed. Do you have any questions about how to share the project, how to participate, what the end result will be, anything like that? Everybody a minute. Okay, Jose is asking if this is going to be the format for each of the graphs. So you guys are going to repeat that same format, and where will we be able to find all of these, Ashley asks. So you guys want to answer those?
Yeah. So the slides that you just showed, that you saw with like the black bar across the top, that's the template. And we're going to have sets. For example, one set will be bar graphs, and it starts with a bar graph, it goes through the set, and it ends with a different bar graph of the same type. Or a stacked line graph. It starts with a stacked line graph, we go through all the slides and end with hopefully on a similar topic, but at least it's the same type of graph. So really the point is about learning to interpret different kinds of visual data. And level of targeted learners like this, I have fairly low level ESL students, and I am going to test it out and see. It's going to depend a lot on presentation, right? Because the general template is fairly simple. The slow reveal is like no language, right? It's very, I think it'll be adaptable for a lot of different contexts. And that was part of it when we were, since we all have different primary focuses, foci, we were all like trying to angle for our particular subject. So we tried to make something that could be, depending on how you present it, it could be useful in a variety of different contexts.
Okay, then Ashley asks where they're going to be able to find these when your EdTech Makerspace project is finished. Do you guys have that answer yet?
I don't think we have that answer quite yet. We set up a generic Google Gmail account that we're using as the host site so that it's not tied to any of our individual accounts.
Might I propose that we add it to the Crowded Learning website? I'm just gonna throw that out there. So Ashley, that is TBD. If I were you, I would maybe fill out the form. Jana, if people fill out the form, they can keep updated on the project, right? It doesn't necessarily, it's not a commitment to participate.
Oh, absolutely not.
Okay.
The form just asks for your name and email and just says you're interested in it, because we're still midstream in this process. Yeah. This is definitely a work in progress. So as we figure out the next steps, like we know what the next steps are because of the course, we just need to work through the next steps. Then if you're on the list, then we'll keep you updated when we're ready to actually conduct the project and at the end when it's done.
Great. Great. So I want to really emphasize a few things. First of all, there are going to be many makerspaces run over the course of the next 2 years through Crowded Learning and through groups like Jana's. So if you are interested in participating in an EdTech makerspace, please subscribe to the EdTech Center's newsletter. If one of my World Ed friends can put that in the chat, that'd be great. That's usually where we are putting out calls for participants in makerspaces, and we will definitely put out more information about the Arizona EdTech Makerspace as well. So please do be sure to subscribe to the newsletter if you're interested in participating. If you're interested in using what has already been created in EdTech Makerspaces, then I'm going to share the link to our Crowded Learning site. We have a lot of products that we have created using the EdTech Makerspace model. So if you go to our work, you can see information about EdTech Makerspaces that are recent, and there's also a tab for the reading skills for today's adults and a tab for the ESL Story Bank. So those products are on that website. So participate, use, and then design. If you're interested in replicating this PD model with a couple of your colleague friends, with your entire program across an entire state, it's a flexible model that can be replicated. So the guide is also on our webpage. It's on the Crowded Learning site. If you scroll down, let me just share my screen. I don't know why I'm trying to just talk through all of this. So if you scroll down on the EdTech Makerspace page, this is the product design and facilitation guide. It's completely open for use. So feel free to grab that and go through the steps to design your project. And then we also have the course, which is available through your Ideal membership if you're an Ideal member state, or on CourseStorm. If one of my friends could also put in the link to our CourseStorm in the chat to that course. I know I have it in the slides, so I can find it. Any questions about the EdTech Makerspace model in general? Okay, Leah. Oh, good question. You could ask your state leaders. We do have a list of states on our website. Let me get that up for you. And if you're not a member, please do have someone from your state reach out to us. This is a great time for it. Our Summer Institute is coming up in August. I'm going to put a link to the Ideal Consortium page in the chat right now. Great question. So for example, Arizona is an Ideal state. So they ran this course through their Ideal membership, but it is open to anyone for a fee. And Ebony just put the CourseStorm link into the chat as well. Thanks, Jana, for that promo. Okay, any other questions about EdTech Makerspace? If not, I think we go ahead and transition into our breakout rooms. I do want to share about our next desk session. You guys seeing my screen right now? because I'm not seeing it. Okay, wait, there it is. Okay, good. Oops, sorry. Our next desk session is coming up. I clicked on something. No, it's coming up in May. Let me get this back up. Sorry, guys. Oh my gosh. Okay, we had a lot of slides. May 13th, it's coming out May 13th at 1 p.m. Eastern. And the title is Building Relevance and Engagement to Keep Learners Motivated and Moving Forward. This one is sponsored by Essential Education, but we're gonna have some practitioners talking to us about teaching soft skills and using formative assessment. So please do join us. Okay, are we seeing it now? Are we seeing it? Are you dizzy? Did I make you all dizzy? This is our next. Okay, Jose, yeah, if you're an ideal member state, contact someone who runs PD in your state about accessing the course, or just send us an email and we're happy to kind of guide you through the process of getting into the course. Thank you, Ebony. So our next desk session, May 13th at 1 p.m. Eastern, please join us. We have our breakout sessions, which I'm gonna open up right now. Also, if Ebony, can you put the link to the COABE sessions back in the chat? We will be at COABE World Education. We have many sessions going on at COABE, and we have 2 booths if you're going in person. So please do drop by and visit us at the booths or come to some of our sessions at COABE. We'll be sharing about the EdTech Makerspace, skill blocks, Digital Equity Act. We'll be talking about all of the topics that we are passionate about at the EdTech Center. So without further ado, I'm going to open up the breakout rooms. You will be able to choose whether you want to join Shirley and talk a little bit more about the Digital Equity Act, or whether you want to join our friends from Arizona and talk more about designing an EdTech Makerspace project. And Ebony just put in the chat the link to our app showing you our COABE sessions. So please join us in the breakout rooms and let's continue the conversation.